They found her in the basement. It was April 27th, 1913. A factory night watchman in Atlanta walked his rounds and stumbled upon the body of a young girl. She was lying in the dirt, face bruised, a strip of her own underclothes twisted tight around her neck. Her arms were cut, her lips swollen, her face beaten. She was only 13 years old. Her name was Mary Phagan. Mary had grown up in Marietta, Georgia. She lived with her widowed mother and worked in the National Pencil Company factory downtown, earning just over $1 a week inserting metal tips into pencils. That Saturday, she had stopped by the factory to collect her small pay envelope. It was a holiday, Confederate Memorial Day, and she wanted the money to attend the parade later. Instead, she never returned home. The watchman, Newt Lee, panicked when he saw the body. At first, in the dim light, he thought she was a bundle of rags, but then he saw the hair, the pale face, the brutal ligature around her throat. He ran to call the police. When officers arrived, they also found 2 notes near the body, scribbled, barely legible. The writing seemed childlike, rambling. One blamed the murder on a long, tall Negro who worked at the factory. The other, equally crude, pointed again toward the black workers. Investigators quickly suspected the notes were staged. Mary's murder shocked Atlanta. She was just a child, innocent, working class. Newspapers seized on every lurid detail, their headlines screaming of strangulation and rape. Crowds gathered outside the factory, demanding answers. The city, already charged with racial and class tension, became a cauldron of rumor and fury. Police questioned the night watchman, but soon turned their eyes toward Leo Frank, the factory superintendent. Frank was a 29-year-old Jewish man from Brooklyn, educated at Cornell, who had moved south to manage his uncle's business. By many accounts, he was socially awkward, stiff, and not well liked by workers. Detectives thought his nervous demeanor was suspicious. He was the last known person to see Mary alive, having given her her pay envelope that afternoon. Another man at the factory quickly drew attention too, Jim Conley, a black janitor with a history of arrests. Conley admitted he had been at the factory that day. At first, he denied everything. But after days of interrogation, he changed his story repeatedly. Finally, he claimed Frank had asked him to help cover up the murder, that Frank killed Mary, then dictated the notes for Conley to write. Conley's testimony would become the cornerstone of the case. From the start, the investigation was riddled with contradictions. The physical evidence was thin. The factory was grimy and crowded, with footprints and smudges everywhere. Conley himself knew details only the killer might have known, like the positioning of Mary's body. Yet his shifting statements made him unreliable. Still, prosecutors decided to build their entire case around him. The trial of Leo Frank opened in July 1913 in a packed Atlanta courtroom. Spectators crowded shoulder to shoulder, fans waving in the summer heat. Outside, mobs gathered daily, chanting for justice. The press painted Frank as cold, calculating, even predatory toward the girls in his factory. Mary's family sat in the gallery, their grief fueling the outrage. Prosecutors argued that Frank lured Mary to his office, made advances, and when she resisted, strangled her with her own clothing. Then, they said, he enlisted Jim Conley to drag the body to the basement. Conley took the stand and gave a dramatic account, pointing his finger at Frank. His words electrified the courtroom. Frank's lawyers fought back, insisting Conley was the true killer. They highlighted Conley's lies, his criminal past, his suspicious knowledge of the crime scene. But Frank's defense struggled against the tide of public anger. His own testimony, halting and uncomfortable, failed to convince. In the deep South of 1913, a Jewish factory boss accused of murdering a white child was an easy villain. After weeks of testimony, the jury took only a few hours to decide. On August 25, 1913, Leo Frank was found guilty of murder. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Crowds outside roared approval. The judge sentenced him to death. But the case did not end there. Frank's attorneys appealed, arguing that the trial had been poisoned by mob influence and unreliable witnesses. National Jewish organizations rallied to his cause. The case drew attention far beyond Georgia, with newspapers in New York and Washington decrying the hysteria and prejudice that surrounded the conviction. Some prominent figures, including former Governor John Slayton, began to doubt the verdict. In 1915, after reviewing the evidence himself, Governor Slayton commuted Frank's death sentence to life in prison. He declared that too much doubt surrounded the case, that the testimony of Jim Conley was deeply suspect. But his decision set off an explosion of fury. Mobs rioted outside the governor's mansion. Slayton had to leave office under guard, his career destroyed. The anger now turned directly toward Frank. On the night of August 16, 1915, a group of armed men broke into the prison farm where he was being held. They kidnapped him, drove him across the countryside to Marietta, Mary Phagan's hometown, and lynched him from an oak tree. Photographs of the hanging body circulated as souvenirs. The men responsible faced no real punishment. The murder of Mary Phagan and the lynching of Leo Frank left scars that shaped the South for decades. In the aftermath, Jewish communities across America felt the tremor of rising anti-Semitism. At the same time, groups of white men in Georgia formed a new iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, declaring themselves defenders of white womanhood. In response, Jewish leaders in New York helped establish the Anti-Defamation League, dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism and injustice. For Mary's family, nothing could undo the loss. She was buried in Marietta, her grave often visited by mourners who remembered her as the little girl whose life was stolen. But over the years, as historians revisited the case, consensus shifted. Evidence pointed more and more toward Jim Conley as the likely killer. Leo Frank, once condemned, came to be seen as the victim of one of America's most infamous miscarriages of justice. More than 70 years later, in 1986, the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles finally granted Frank a posthumous pardon. They did not overturn the verdict outright, but they acknowledged that the state had failed to protect him from mob violence and denied him the fair process every citizen deserves. The story of Mary Phagan is not just about a child's murder. It is about a city inflamed by fear, prejudice, and vengeance. It is about how a justice system can collapse under the weight of public rage. And it is about how one tragedy created ripples, sparking hate, but also inspiring a movement to stand against it. Mary was 13. She wanted to see a parade. Instead, her name became bound forever to one of the darkest trials in American history. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories if you dare.